What's up, everybody? Welcome back to U.S. History Notes. We're continuing on with the 1942 lecture series. We'll probably be wrapping it up here this week. So far, we've kind of been going back and forth looking at events in 1942, some of the big battles from the European theater and Pacific theater. Today, we're hitting some more stuff on the Pacific theater of the war. The last one we covered was the Battle of Midway. That was the first time America kind of threw some punches back, because remember, after the Pearl Harbor attack for about 6 months, the Japanese just ran amok, and every battle they engaged in out there, they were winning, and they were gobbling up island after island, and they took a lot of territory from the British and the Americans. And now, after that Battle of Midway, which is an all-aircraft carrier one, that was the first time we really took out some of the Japanese ships and kind of put them on the run. Now, that was much quicker than what the Japanese had anticipated. They thought that America was going to throw punches back, but they figured they had about a year to a year and a half before that would happen. And we ended up, because our aircraft carriers weren't sunk at Pearl Harbor, we were able to respond and attack back and go on the offensive much quicker than they had anticipated. Today, we're going to go over the first actual ground fighting, where Marines and Army Rangers landed and fought against the Japanese Army on a little island out in the Pacific. So before we do that, though, I want to show you this map of the Pacific, and this kind of shows the Japanese Empire at the height of their power. So up here, kind of in the northern part, and a little bit is cut off, there are the islands of Japan. Remember, 4 big islands plus 1,000 other tiny little islands that make up what is the modern day and the 1942 country of Japan. They've invaded and taken out Korea, a big chunk of China where a lot of the population lives out there. They took the Philippines. That was an American territory. Remember, we had won that back in the Spanish-American War. That was one of the first things we had covered in class. And then now they're down in the Dutch East Indies and New Guinea. This is where the oil was. Now, that was a big step by taking those islands. And they knew if they went and invaded those islands without, they were part of a European colonies essentially at the time. And they knew that if they had gone and attacked those islands before doing Pearl Harbor, America and Britain would have declared war on them. That was why they chose to do the Pearl Harbor attack first, and then they figured those targets would be a little bit softer after they took out a bunch of American and British ships. So over here is Hawaii, okay? That's still kind of firmly American territory. Even with the Pearl Harbor attack, they didn't actually try to invade those islands. We were worried they were gonna, but that hadn't happened. And then here is Midway Island. Remember, they were the last chunk of notes. This is what they were trying to take. We kind of lured them into a trap and then decisively won that battle, and that pushed them back. So from that point on, we're on the offensive. We're attacking them. And basically for the rest of the war, and there is going to be years of war left, Japan is just trying to hold on to what they have. Now, what island? We know we're going to go in and try to defeat the Japanese Empire. We have to go conquer Japan. But where do we start? Because even though it just looks like little specks of dust out there, the Japanese are very well fortified, and they've taken all these key islands. Basically, everything inside the circle pretty much belongs to them. And the islands they have, and a lot of them are tiny little specks of dust out in the middle of the Pacific, they have really entrenched and fortified themselves. So there are literally thousands of islands under their control. Where the heck do we start at? Well, after strategically looking at it and stuff, the Pacific Naval Command and President Roosevelt end up deciding that the place we have to start at is this little known island that nobody has ever heard of before, at least nobody in America, called Guadalcanal. Try pronouncing that a couple times fast. So Guadalcanal, if you follow my cursor, here's where it is. This little island right down there in the Pacific. Now, why the heck would we pick this little jungle island to go to first? Well, for one, it's out on the exterior perimeter. It's pretty far away from Japan. Part of what's cut off down here, this is Australia, okay? That's going to be kind of the base of operations for the American and British war effort out in the Pacific. Well, okay, here's Hawaii. Now, if you went over, you can't see it, but way over here is where California would be. All right. We need to get supplies from basically California, from the Pacific coast of America, and we need to ship supplies over to Australia, which will be our base of operations. From there, we're going to start pushing up north and start beating the Japanese back to Japan. All right. The problem was why we focused on Guadalcanal first. This little island out here actually had a Japanese air base. And from that air base, if the Japanese held that island and kept it and controlled it, any American ships that were coming in to Australia, they could come in and bomb them. And remember, we're figuring out now that the ships with the big guns aren't the best weapons in naval warfare anymore. It's actually the aircraft carriers. Planes can, one plane, which is very easy to manufacture and only takes one guy to operate it, can come and cause a lot of damage and destruction to a really big ship if it's equipped with a heavy payload bomb or a torpedo. So once you get 2 or 3 planes or a whole squadron of planes coming in attacking a ship, that ship's usually going to be a goner. So letting the Japanese have an air base there, that's just, we can't do it because we're going to have literally thousands of ships going back and forth between Australia and California, supplying up our base of operations out there as we continue our war efforts. So first thing we have to do before we can really base up down there and get a lot of supplies and manpower, we have to take out that Japanese air base on Guadalcanal. Once we do that, then American and British ships can travel back and forth unobstructed, and they won't get hammered by the Japanese Air Force. So next slide here, and this gets into what I want you to know for Guadalcanal. You don't have to write down necessarily everything on this slide. I probably will have couple quiz questions that will tie into this slide, and you can expect 1 or 2 exam questions that would tie into this pretty important battle too from the Pacific Theater. Now, one thing, here's a bonus for you guys that are actually watching the notes video and not just like clicking through and pausing on the slide and just jotting this stuff down or not watching it at all. If you're listening, another thing that would be a key point that I might end up putting on a quiz, so hint, hint, I would write this down. Guadalcanal is the first time, really, for World War II, and one of the first times in American history that the U.S. soldiers fight in jungle warfare. Okay, we're going to have a lot more of that down the road when we cover the Vietnam War. For World War II, there's not a ton of jungle fighting, but Guadalcanal is a tropical, hot, kind of sweaty, very humid little island. So our soldiers are actually quite miserable when they go and land in there because it's very tropical conditions. So a lot of disease, a lot of starvation, and I'm going to get into why that is in just a second. So anyway, other key things that I would also want you to write down. It's the first American offensive in the Pacific Theater of World War II. Up to this point in the war, America's kind of been getting its butt kicked and getting pushed back. And then Midway was our first big, we threw a punch back and we had a big decisive win. And this is going to be the first territory that we take from the Japanese. So the first American offensive where we go on the attack in World War II out in the Pacific. All right. It's another thing you could have. I don't really care how you would write that down there, but I would want you to know the information I covered on the last slide that the reason we chose this island was it had a strategically placed air base on it and that they could bomb American ships. So it was the air base was the key part of why we were taking that island out. And then also know that Australia, which is a British colony at the time, is going to be our base of operations. That's friendly territory, and we have to be able to get shipping through there unobstructed, where we're not getting attacked by the Japanese. We don't want to have the same problem we're dealing with this year out in the Atlantic against the Germans, where German U-boats are picking off our ships right and left. Okay, the Japanese don't have as many U-boats. They do have some, not quite as big a threat as what we were facing out in the Atlantic. So if we take out that air base, we'll be looking pretty good to go. Now, a key part of this battle, Japan actually sets a trap for us. So down here, I can't move that. I wish I could. The American forces, and here's that island of Guadalcanal. I'm sorry, I should have probably raised that up a little more. We end up landing on the south side of the island. We're worried that our guys are going to land and they're going to come in under fire and the Japanese will be shooting at us. They actually didn't do that. The Japanese kind of set us up for a trap, and kind of like how we did in the Battle of Midway. Their army had retreated in closer to the air base and was more on the north side of the island. So our guys just unload a division of Marines, all right? Thousands of American soldiers unload on the island. They get all their equipment out, which was kind of weird because they were expecting the Japanese to be there waiting for them, shooting at them, and to be landing on the beaches under fire. And that didn't happen. So now, later on, looking on it through history, now we know why that was. They were setting up a trap. They wanted to get this whole American army unloaded there. And then what we didn't know at the time was there was a Japanese fleet of warships that was hiding in the north side of the island. And remember, satellites don't exist yet. We aren't taking like accurate photos from space where we'd be able to find that. Those ships had hit over there, and we had no idea that there was a big Japanese fleet waiting and hiding. And just waiting to come attack us and the American supply ships as soon as we had unloaded all of our soldiers. Because essentially what they do, they come around that first night after we had unloaded this division of American Marines, and they sneak attack all the American ships that are supplying those guys. It's the worst naval defeat other than Pearl Harbor, really, in American history. And this time we were actually ready for them, but this Japanese fleet sneaks around the island, starts shelling our ships. We end up having, I think, 3 or 4 of our cruisers get sunk. The other American ships, they return fire. This battle all happens very chaotically in the middle of the night, but they end up chasing off the American Navy. So initially it's a defeat for us, all right, but the battle's not quite over yet. So now what they've done is we have a whole army of guys on this island, and they are totally cut off, and they can't get any supplies to them. The ammunition they have, that's all they got. The food they got, the medicine, the antibiotics or whatever, they only have what they arrived on the beaches with. So soon after that, our soldiers start to starve and die of disease, and they're very, very hard pressed. Like in the intro clips to the Pacific, sometimes if you ever end up watching that series, they'll interview some of the guys, the veterans that were Americans that fought in this campaign. And most of those guys that fought at Guadalcanal, I'll hear them describe it, and they talk about it being that it was a campaign, like a military campaign of starvation and disease. That's what they most remember about it. It was being really hot, really sticky. Most of our guys had dysentery. That's where you get like kind of basically a parasite in your belly, and you end up having horrible diarrhea where you just can't stop pooping. Any fluids just run through you and make you miserable, and you're pooping 20, times a day or something, but running not solid ones. And they also talk a lot about being hungry and starving. They capture some rice from the Japanese army. So a lot of these guys, they're basically surviving on white rice for a couple week period. Now, eventually the American Navy regroups. We send in another fleet of ships, and we have another naval battle with the Japanese fleet, and we're able to chase them off. We win round 2 of the fighting. Once that happens, we resupply and refortify our army on the ground, and then eventually it's a big victory for America. We're able to take out that air base. We're able to end the threat to American shipping. There you have it, the Battle of Guadalcanal. So that is kind of the beginning of the end maybe for the Japanese. We begin to start pushing them back. There is 1,000 little battles, maybe not literally 1,000, but there's quite a few battles where we're going to be fighting over small little tropical islands like this. Now, I'm not going to be able to, I don't have time to get into every single one. And honestly, I don't know about every single battle. I'm only going to hit a few of the highlight ones for the rest of our World War II unit. But this is a pretty notable one because it's the first time that the American and Japanese military and World War II is squaring off against each other on an island. We see a lot of disturbing things at the end of the battle when basically the Japanese army that was stationed at Guadalcanal is they're done for. They're totally cut off from their Navy. They can't get resupplied. They're out of ammunition. They're starving to death. Instead of surrendering like most armies would, even a German unit or, definitely an American or Allied army unit would, the Japanese commanders say, no, that would be dishonorable to surrender. And they end up doing what's called banzai charges, which terrifies and freaks out our soldiers because they can't wrap their heads around it. There's such a big cultural gap. We can't understand. Our soldiers couldn't understand why they wouldn't just surrender. But rather than surrendering to the American army after they were definitely defeated in the battle, most of the Japanese troops, they just end up fixing bayonets and they charge into American machine gun lines, knowing they're going to die. Basically, there are no survivors from the Japanese side, or very, very few. And they just go try to stab as many American guys as they can. And the thought was that would satisfy honor. They're dying for the empire, and they're going to give their life. They're sacrificing their life to slow down the American advance. So they know they're going to die. They have that mindset. The Japanese soldiers at the end of the battle are told that you're dead, you're a goner. You're satisfying honor, and your job is kill as many Americans as you possibly can. And you can see, if you're an American soldier fighting against that, it's a little bit disconcerting. That's a pretty terrifying enemy to face and go up against. All right, that's what I have for you for Guadalcanal. If you have any questions about it, shoot me an email and I'll get back with you and clarify. All right, take care.